All right, welcome everybody. This is another Google Hangout.
Welcome, nice.
Hi, Daniel. I'm Kristen Anton. I'm the New Tactics Online Community Builder, and this Google Hangout is meant to complement our New Tactics Online discussion on working safely and effectively with documentation tools. This is a week-long online discussion happening on our website, and we're hosting this in partnership with Herodox and Benetech. And this topic is part of our conversation series on seeking justice. So when we talk about human rights documentation in this context, we're talking about the documentation of human rights violations. So today in this Google Hangout, we're going to discuss the topic, where and when does documentation happen and how can we make it more secure? This Hangout is being broadcast live and it's being recorded, and I will post the recording of this Hangout in the New Tactics online discussion on the New Tactics website. So now I want to ask each of you to introduce yourselves. We have Molly, Enrique, and Daniel. So Daniel, why don't I start with you, if you could just briefly introduce yourself to the group.
Yeah, I'm Daniel Desposito. I'm the Executive Director of Herodox. That's Human Rights Information and Documentation Systems. And information security is part of our work. The main thrust of what we do is helping other NGOs to build systems to document human rights violations, but also any kind of information challenge, like complex websites, for example. But increasingly, I mean, security is a very important part of what we do. It's not the main thing. I mean, we wouldn't define ourselves as that, but it's an essential part of it, of a parcel.
Great, thanks, Daniel. Enrique, could you please introduce yourself?
Hi everyone. My name is Enrique Piraces. I am the Vice President of the Human Rights Program at Benetech, a non-profit technology company that is based in the Silicon Valley, and that is behind Martus, one of the premier open source end-to-end encryption tools for human rights documentation. I know Daniel, Molly for a while, so I'm very excited about this conversation.
Thank you. And Molly, could you please introduce yourself?
Yes. Hi, I'm Molly Land. I'm a professor at the University of Connecticut School of Law and the Yukon Human Rights Institute. And my work focuses on the intersection of human rights and new technologies, in particular recently looking at how we can use new technologies to promote and protect human rights, including in the context of documentation. So I'm very excited to be involved in this conversation as well.
Great. Thanks, Molly. I'm hoping a few other people will be able to join us, and if they do, I'll ask them to introduce themselves, and they can go ahead and join in this discussion. So now I wanted to just briefly summarize what we talked about yesterday on the Hangout and some of the comments that have been shared in the online discussion, and then introduce today's topic. So yesterday we talked about why is security important to human rights documentation. We had a couple people on the Hangout, including Enrique, and basically what was discussed is that practitioners in human rights documentation face resistance in their documentation efforts because they are agents of change, and that by nature provokes resistance. And the resistance looks different depending on the context that they're working in. The data that's being collected includes data from vulnerable populations, evidence about the actions of the documenter, and ethical implications about the topic being documented. And the risks to the information being collected include information loss, privacy loss, and tampering. But we know that protecting this data isn't just protecting it for the sake of the data. We know that this information makes those populations from whom we're collecting the information more vulnerable. And we acknowledge that it's our responsibility to protect the populations for whom we're collecting the information, and we need to consider the impact that insecure data may have on these populations both now and in the future. So that's a very brief summary of what we talked about yesterday, and Enrique, feel free to go ahead and add anything else that you thought was important. But I also wanted to move us on to today's topic, which is where and when does documentation actually happen, and how can we make the process more secure? Enrique, do you want to start us off with this topic that the where and when piece of it, that it's not always human rights organizations that are necessarily collecting this information, and it's not always about collecting information of violations that happened in the past, right? It's also humanitarian organizations that are collecting information today, but maybe not for the purposes of human rights efforts. So, Enrique, do you want to kind of introduce this topic?
Sure, I will be delighted. So I would like to share with you two statements, and I don't think that they are necessarily exhaustive, but I think that they may be a good place to start. On the one end, I think that the traditional monolithical understanding of the human rights field as something very easy to understand, you know, that group of people that work around just one set of particular issues, in the past mostly understood as transitional justice or, you know, human rights violations in conflict, it has evolved, right? Like I think that we are in a moment where the human rights field, if there is such a thing, is definitely quite complex and diverse. So from that perspective, the things that may be documented, or the topics that we may be, or others may be documented about, are definitely more varied, more diverse. So that is one first kind of like a statement, you know, like there's definitely more things. On the other end, the people engaged in documentation are more. In the past, you know, we thought that, you know, most of the people pursuing documentation would be activists or lawyers, and again, this is a gross oversimplification. And when I speak of the past, I'm probably thinking of 20 years ago or potentially more. And today we have definitely a more diverse set of actors doing this. You know, the easier to understand are, of course, still activists that play an incredibly important role on this, but also journalists, citizen journalists, and definitely professionalized human rights practitioners. So that's kind of like one first cloud of statement. The second bit, or the parallel line of thought around that, has to do with putting the perspective around documentation on the vulnerable populations and not on the documentarian. If we think of the people that may be in a position of vulnerability, think, for example, the populations that are being displaced in one of the many conflicts around the globe, if you try to follow them in their path to safety, for example, you will see that they interact with different agencies, with different groups that are doing different things beyond human rights documentation. An example of that could be anyone trying to provide services for refugees, anyone that is trying to potentially survey the children that are in need of particular health support. Or, for example, someone that may be interested in something that is definitely closer to the human rights field, someone that may be interested in tracking, you know, how prevalent gender-based violence is. So those are kind of like two general statements that I think can help us, you know, frame, you know, this challenging reality around, you know, where is data being collected, where are human rights violations being documented. And let me make a pause there to give others the opportunity to either agree, disagree, or propose a different line of thought.
No, if I can take the mic, well, I would agree with Enrique. Yeah, for sure. I mean, you're looking at different kinds of actors, explicitly or implicitly collecting information about individuals, which sometimes can be, you know, can be sensitive, you know, I mean, to these individuals, especially personal data about, I mean, there's the explicit documentation of a human rights violation where you're collecting a testimony, but there's also the simple fact of having a list of visitors in the office can be, you know, if you're, for example, a LGBT organization in a country where even being gay or lesbian is, you know, can attract you serious harm, and having a register of persons coming to your office, and that can be taken. It's not, you know, explicitly human rights documentation, but it is sensitive information that is in your hands, and that can lead to endangering other people. So it's not as Enrique is right. If I understood what you're saying, is it's not as there's all kinds of information being collected and handled by all different kinds of people in the purpose of improving human rights. Yeah, that's all I had to say.
I can jump in as well. Enrique, I think your overview makes a lot of sense. I think it's exactly right that we're documenting and collecting information in many different kinds of situations, and there's more people involved. It actually raises for me a question, and I want to throw it out to see, I don't know the answer, which is, should we be thinking about this as a problem of human rights documentation or a problem of technology? Because, Enrique, your comment raises for me the idea that you know, this is about responsible technology and using technology responsibly, regardless of whether you're using it for human rights documentation or for other purposes, for gathering information to direct humanitarian response or to organize refugee assistance efforts. On the other hand, it strikes me that there are probably certain kinds of things that human rights documenters do, human rights investigators do, that requires a particular response. So the answer is probably we need both. So we probably need awareness and outreach with respect to technologies generally, that anytime you post something to the internet, you should think about who and what information, whose images are displayed and what information is shared. But then what are the particular problems that the human rights field needs to think about in terms of what human rights investigators do with this technology?
Thanks, Molly. I'm going to ask Carolina to briefly introduce herself because she's just joined, and then I'm going to pass it back to Enrique and see if he wants to try to respond to your questions. Carolina, can you please introduce yourself?
Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Carolina. I'm from Guatemala, and I am a researcher in the National Police Archive, and we work like 8 years doing quantitative research with HRDAC in the United States. And our work includes use documents in original and documents online, like digital documents. And we make samples, ask questions directly to the documents. So security is important for keep secure the data and the documents too. And that's it.
Great, thanks. Glad you can join us. So Carolina, today we are focusing this Google Hangout and the online discussion on the question, where and when does documentation happen and how can we make it more secure? And we were just talking about how the actors who are doing the documenting is much more diverse than just the activists and the lawyers, and that the kind of information that's being collected is pretty large. And the question that Molly posed now is, should we be thinking of this as a problem of human rights documentation or a problem of technology? And Enrique, I want to pass this back to you.
Great. Hi, Carolina. Bienvenida. So to Molly's question, or point, I guess, I said that it's definitely a very interesting question. It's definitely a very interesting point. And wait, I think I made something. We're still there? Yes. Okay. Yeah. So I would say that this starts to open the conversation around, what's the role that human rights documentation technology plays, and who should be driving the bus, like if that's an analogy that makes use of this. And for me, and again, I'm very biased because of my perspective on technology and the human rights field, so I will welcome any disagreement with this. But my sense is that it will be very important that the mandate of a human rights organization that is pursuing advocacy using certain types of documentation is what should drive the bus. I mean, and again, I don't think that that's the most controversial bit of any statement. So that said, I think that in thinking of technology, I think that there's three things that I can extract from what Molly's saying. On the one end, I think it's very important that those that are developing, deploying, or training on human rights documentation tools or related are aware of the real needs of human rights organizations. That I think it's and in that sense I think it's important for them to understand when human rights documentation happens. My sense is that most techno activists, and to this point I have to include myself at least at some point of my professional career, I would say that many of us, at least again at some point, had a very limited understanding of how things work in real life, and we maybe end up like thinking that by providing support to someone that has declared to be an activist on an IRC channel, we are kind of like helping some sort of like revolution or, human rights campaign. The reality is that, human rights work is definitely more complex, and it has multiple layers on every single aspect. So it would be very important, I think, that for techno-activists or tool developers to understand, when this happens attached to the needs of an organization. So in terms of, how is that we should focus on responsible technology or responsible human rights documentation, I think that this starts to bring slowly, the ethical conversation around this. I think that I would say that we need to, more than responsible technology, and again, I don't want to dismiss or the point. I think I'm just trying to suggest that we switch it slightly. Is that it's more kind of like informed tool development that is truly, against documented needs from the field. So it's a slightly different. Still speak to responsibility. And in terms of human rights documentation, I tend to think that it will be at some point important to understand that there's different layers. And again, this is crossed from multiple categories, but there's different types of documentarians, right? Like there are the highly professionalized documentarians, those that are potentially involved in an effort of international justice, of formal international justice. Think of the ICC. That has a group of investigators. They act against a very particular types of standards, and they, I believe, do documentation in a highly professional, responsible way. But then you start, and this is nothing that goes up and down. I'm just thinking that it's a wide spectrum. There are different people documenting this. So for different populations, I think that it will be important that we focus on responsible documentation and responsible claims around this documentation. But in thinking, and again, I'm talking a lot, I'll stop in 10 seconds. But in thinking of today's topic, I think that what it should be highlighted, and I'm not dodging the ball on any other topic, I'm just trying to focus on what Christina invited us to discuss. I think that the big piece here is about, needs assessment, us understanding, how the flow of information is happening. And if I can throw one other comment here, I think that, for example, I think it's going to be important for us to understand around the when, that some documentation, and again, I think this may be a poor choice of words for this, but I think that some human rights documentation is active, like someone is pursuing, the documentation of something that he or she may understand as a potential evidence or testimony around human rights violation, and some other documentation is passive. Someone is documenting something else, for a different reason, and some human rights documentation is being embedded there. And again, I'm just thinking of the when for this. So let me again stop there. I tend to talk too much. I'll stop here.
Yeah, if I may also respond to Molly's question. Yeah, I think there's a part of it which is related to technology itself, and a part of it which is related to human rights documentation work. And looking at the technology side, I mean, technology we use today, we're always using technologies of one sort or another, but what makes things, I think, quite unique today for the human rights networks that we work with is the use of online tools, and the sort of the need and the sort of like addiction to these tools to be able to collaborate, particularly online, to edit documents that they want to present for advocacy, to collect information and store it online. And I think this is a crucial challenge, which wasn't necessarily the case even 4 or 5 years ago. And how to do that safely, understanding that this often is very sensitive information, and not always, but that's something you need to look at, and that's where human rights organizations may be doing things which are not absolutely safe nowadays, and that's quite worrying for us. And it's moving forward on this thought about how to work safely online, because online is not going to go away. So let's look at how that can be done safely. We have to realize, accept that people will continue to do that, work that way. And the second is, with regards to human rights documentation, is it beyond the fact of what method we use to store or communicate information, there is the fact that looking at this information itself, the nature of this information, what kind of information access do I have, what are the likely risks and threats that I face, and this also goes forward into the sort of like the responsible data argument, or the ethical thinking about that uses technology or not should have a number of policies and processes about handling of information. Whether that was done. I have a background with ICRC, International Committee of the Red Cross. In those days, we used to have a pouch. Email didn't exist when I started working, and we had very clear rules and guidelines within my organization about who had access to this kind of information, and who within the staff could see, for example, very sensitive protection documents, as they were called, about prison visits or interviews of prisoners and so on and so forth. And there was a very well-defined chain of information and who had access to what within the organization. And that was at the time of paper, that was the time of diplomatic pouches and this kind of thing. So that hasn't changed, and that has perhaps been lost a bit today. And we also see a bit too much informality around the way information is handled. It's not really given enough thought, I think, in many cases. I think starting with Euridocs, I mean, we've been engaged since the beginning of the year now in a process of reviewing how it's actually possible to do. It's a process of common sense, but it's not easy. There's always the getting a group of staff, or however big that staff may be, or volunteers, to have the same approach to handling information, the same understanding of what is sensitive, what should be handled in a special way. It's not easy to get there. It's not something that's done overnight, and that's maybe part of the problem as well. So again, to summarize for Molly, the thoughts there, technology is even more prevalent today, and it's a great thing. It offers great advantages, but also there are greater risks than was the case before. But fundamentally, I think every organization needs to have some kind of process or policy document about the information it collects, because human rights documentation work is by nature often very sensitive, and does include sensitive information which can endanger people if it's made public, or if it's revealed to the wrong persons. That's what I'd say.
Could I build on that? And actually, Carolina, I don't know if you want to jump in. I'm happy to defer. But I just one small point, building on what Daniel said, is I think I agree completely, and I think that's very true with respect to organizations. But Enrique brought up a good point in the beginning, which is that we have more people engaged in documentation, including many people who are not affiliated with an organization, and many who don't know that they are doing documentation when they take a picture of a photo and upload it to a website. And I think my question about how we frame it has to do with how we reach those people and talk to them about, raise awareness about the safety risks that might be associated with technology. So if we're talking about involving ordinary people in documentation efforts, how do we raise their awareness about the sensitive nature of human rights documentation, which generally for me involves making claims on a state, exposing violations, yes, the question is how do we reach the people who aren't otherwise encompassed by organizational protocols?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a good question. Outreach, right? I mean, it would be interesting to talk to witness about this, because they're having this precise problem that you mentioned with regards to a number of people who are not necessarily human rights or staff members of human rights organizations using YouTube to post videos and so on. So they have their InformaCamp project, and they have also been doing a lot of work around anonymizing videos, for example. And I think it may be the best approach for them, I think, which they're getting at, is actually at one point they would need to talk to Google and sort of like hiding of faces into everything that's posted from Syria about revolution, for example, and just to preemptively blur faces, for example, to protect people, because the idea of proactively reaching everybody out there, it's very, very elusive. It's very difficult, my contribution there.
Can I say something?
Mm-hmm.
If I return to the title of this conversation, I will put something in the chat before I have more clearly. And when I think in safety documentation and information, and what the other side, the internet, and the needs to be public things, and the purpose is not repeat things. I think we have two scenarios. First one is the past things. All these kind of things happened, probably or perhaps in relation with wars things, or like the cultural documentation. It's more medical stuffs, or something are happening in today, during today. So are two scenarios for share information and documented things. And the internet, it's an important tool, but probably it's not the best when we're talking about safety. But here, in my first example, it's the webpage of REMI. REMI make informe or investigate in Guatemala what happened during the conflict, and they take a lot of testimony. And recently, the last year, they put almost testimonies online. And it's interesting when we thought what is the purpose of the organization and what is the needs of the civilization. So we, like Guatemalans, want to know what happened. And here don't exist censor about the names. You can read a lot of information here. The second one example is in United States, this collection of John C. Cutler. And it's interesting because if you see that information, it's about Guatemalans, but you can read the names. All the names are censored. But if you came to Guatemala, you can read the documents in paper and you can read the names. So it are two examples for share this opposite conflict, this conflict about the institutions. Because like somebody say, what is the objective of institution? It's more than ethical things, I think. Because the reason is for not happen again, or the reason is protect to the data, or protect to an institution to not go to court for something like that. Mm-hmm. And I really don't have the answer, but for me, like Guatemala, it's really important to know who people was involved in this experiment, for example, because we can research more information in other institutions, because the information in these records, it's not complete. And only with information online, I can do nothing, really nothing. And my third example are all documentation desclasificados of United States. And you can see documentation about Guatemala. And so many names are censored, but others no. But the information there can help to Guatemalans to go to other places and continue working and searching information. So in this case, don't happen much if all the information are censored or not. And the last one have to be much for example in present. WikiLeaks, you know, have documents in present and the past. So in conclusion, is we have to be present these two scenarios. Information happened in the past, and information is shared with acts in the present. And what is the best way to share that information? That's my question.
You know, I'm very happy that Carolina was able to join this hangout. I think that she's bringing a perspective that I think is coming from current work, you know, like from long-term work that remains active. So I am very grateful that she's able to share with us some of this. And I already see a lot of homework for us to read. I see a lot of links that we need to now explore. And if may I mean, I know that we have a relatively limited time, and I would like just to add something, building on top of what Carolina has mentioned in terms of like thinking of the past, like the information that was that was collected or made or exist in the past, as well as the work today. I would like to add a dimension in thinking of the future, around the question of the when. So one thing that I think is becoming increasingly important is for us to understand data that may not be necessarily produced by people, that may be produced as the result of other efforts, of other actions. An example of that is what we now tend to call the Internet of Things. There's going to be a growing number of devices that are going to be able to provide, to collect, transfer, store, etc., metadata, and in some cases direct content about a large number of issues, from the future refrigerators that will be able to store how often you drink 2% fat milk, to sensors that will be documenting the humidity around a potential mass grave in a remote area of the world. So I think that, this is a bit of a different issue to problematize at the moment because it's itself a nascent issue, but I think that this is something that we need to keep in the back of our heads as we start to think about when documentation happens, especially considering that this data will be in the future, that large amount of data that others may access to potentially contextualize an incident, to potentially verify another one. So again, I don't have a good way to problematize this just yet. I just wanted to add it to the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the
yeah.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Daniel.
Sorry. No, go ahead, Molly.
I think the other problem that point raises, which I think is a great point, is the question of consent, especially when you're thinking about the persistence of data and data existing out there, and A, being collected maybe without us knowing it, and B, persisting over time and being reused, is that it's very difficult to figure out how to get true consent. I mean, it's always difficult in investigations anyway, but it becomes more difficult when you don't know precisely, and you can't have guarantees with respect to how data will be used in the future.
Yeah, I also wanted to say something about consent, and it's interesting, Carolina, because this question you're raising has nothing to do with technology, really. It's really about how you handle information, and this kind of situation is really typical of a dilemma, in a way, because there's no clear-cut. It has to be discussed and thought about on a case-to-case basis, and looking at the fact that you're dealing with, because in a way, it's easy to say that, yes, you should ask the person before publishing the information of the consent, but what do you do if it's skilled persons? What if you do if it's persons that you don't have the contact information for them anymore? It could help them, it could help family reunifications. That's where the reality starts to get complex, and that's where you need to have an ethical discussion around that, I think, about what's the best way forward, what's the best interest of the victim, these kinds of questions, without having you can decide to be very radical and say we will not publish any names unless we have explicit consent, or you can be more pragmatic and say, look, for 99.9% of the cases it's going to be very useful. We'll give a time of, let's say, make a public awareness campaign and say people have 30 days to come and say they don't want their name to be published or something like that. That would be more pragmatic. So there's no right solution there. It's a question of having realizing that it's a dilemma, and that you have to be discussed more on an ethical basis than a technology basis, I think, and that's what's very interesting in your question. But I think we're going to be able to discuss that tomorrow a bit more, or the next days. No, I think this ethical thing, because I see more comes down to that. And consent is one aspect of. It's a fundamental aspect of human rights documentation from the start. It was always consent. If you go back to the manuals, where there's a couple of manuals that were done by the Forum Asia back in 1985 or something. I mean, in these days, it was all about consent and these kinds of ethical basis for data collection. And that, I think, has been lost a bit nowadays. You know what I mean? People don't talk about, they presume it, but again and again, people I feel are taking a lot of shortcuts, with regards to data collection. That's a bit, that's not so great.
And there's a loss of control
Yeah,
as
that's what I have to
well.
say.
So when you use information for human rights purposes, and if you say we're only going to put it in a report, that's one thing. But when you put things online, as Carolina was talking about, they take on a life of their own, and they could be taken up by someone else and used for other purposes. And so it just becomes very difficult to maintain that control.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Enrique actually shared a really great example of this yesterday with the Belfast project.
Mm-hmm.
Any other last points that you all wanted to put out there before we wrap up?
No.
No, but just another point that's interesting from Carolina is that, which is basically public, right? Public records. And that would be one main division, because we also talk often about the information that is collected by an organization for its internal purposes, its internal analysis, which will never be published, and how to keep that private. That's what implicitly is often referred to. But it's true that the information is often collected with the explicit purpose of making it public. And the ECHR court cases, for example, that's another example where you have a lot of information on individuals, and sometimes the perpetrators are not guilty, and their case remains there forever, and they complain to the court to have their names removed. I mean, it's working with information is always tough, and always requires I would say it's just as much about the ethics and about the technology. Mm-hmm. And the risk and so on.
And just to add one thing to that, which is, and I've been thinking about this for a while and don't have any solutions, but I think the meaning of public differs depending on the format in which the information is held and collected. So if information is available and publicly available, but to get it you have to go to a courthouse and you have to hand copy records that are only available in paper copy, there's a lot less risk of that information getting out there to people. Whereas if it's digitized and freely and easily copyable online, that's just a very different idea of public. And so I think when we talk to people about how their information is being used, when we collect it, we have to take into account that the manner and mode of collecting that information will affect the risks to the people involved.
Okay, this is a ton of information, really great points, lots of interesting challenges that are being raised here, and hopefully in the online forum on the New Tactics website we can dive deeper into some of these challenges and these questions and potentially suggest some solutions. I don't know if that's possible, but let's give it a shot. And yeah, let's open this up to a larger audience on the New Tactics site. So please bring these examples and these questions and challenges and ideas as well to the New Tactics discussion today and tomorrow. Our next hangout is going to be Thursday at this time, and we'll talk about how do we select the right approach to documentation. So this is really coming down to both the security aspect but also effectiveness. How do we get the right tool for the right purpose, as Carolina was pointing out. And then Friday's hangout is also at the same time, which is 2:00 p.m. UTC, Universal Time. And that topic on Friday will be effective and safe collaborative documentation and information sharing. So I'll be sharing out the links to those hangouts a few minutes before each one starts, and I hope you guys can join us then too. So I think I'm just going to wrap up. We're 10 minutes over. I look forward to seeing all of your comments in the New Tactics discussion. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, everybody, as well. Nice meeting you. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.